I'm Greg Waples with the National Association of Secondary School Principals. We are very proud partners of the Restart Network and happy to be on with you this afternoon. We've heard a lot in the presentation so far from the high-level researchers and district-level officials talking about some of the post-pandemic shifts in K-12 education. And now we're going to drill down a little bit further for some perspective from building leaders and what's actually happening from the perspective of folks who are in the school every single day working with teachers and students on the ground. So we have a couple of excellent principals affiliated with NASSP on with us this afternoon. We have Dr. Michael Rubin, who is the principal of Uxbridge High School in Massachusetts. Welcome, Dr. Rubin. And we have Dr. Terri Daniels, who is the principal of Folsom Middle School in California. Welcome, Dr. Daniels. And moderating this conversation this afternoon will be our friend coming back to us once again, Dr. Susan Theriault. So I will now turn it over to Susan to start the conversation.
Thanks so much, Greg. And I also need to say that Greg is also an advisory board member, a valued advisory board member for the Restart Network, and really critical to making sure school leaders are represented in the conversations we're having at the network. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Rubin and Dr. Daniels. I'm really, really excited to be chatting with you today. So I just want to start off with one of the things that my team, the Restart Network team, has been noticing. There's just a fatigue surrounding the notion of pandemic recovery, and we see it coinciding with the decrease, not surprisingly, the sunsetting of federal funding, or the fiscal cliff, as many people are referring to it as. And the ability to kind of fund those recovery-specific interventions. But we also know, and from the research that we've just seen, that there are still challenges our students are facing and schools continue to face in terms of both academic, social, emotional, and well-being of students and staff. And we're also seeing real concerns about retaining educators and hiring new educators. And in light of what Elise just presented with regard to this expert educator model, that's a real challenge and also a seemingly successful intervention. We're also seeing chronic absenteeism at new heights and real differences across schools and districts. So it sounds gloomy, what I'm starting to say, but I'm not trying to say that. We're really interested in kind of how you're thinking about this work and your work right now. We're out of the emergency set and we're into our day-to-day. I know it's still not routine, but it's more routine than it has been over the past 3 years. So I'm wondering if both of you could chime in on just this bigger question and whether you can share with our audience your perspective on this post-COVID context and in your school, and what the next 5 years looks like for you. Have you seen positive changes? What are your biggest challenges? I'm sure you have lots to say in this space. So I don't know if Dr. Rubin or Dr. Daniels, who would like to go first, but I would love to hear from both of you.
I can start off, and I am working in a middle school. So I think right now it's really interesting to have this question at this point. I come from a big family of educators, extended, and we were together this weekend, and it was interesting to me talking to a few of my family members who actually are in the high school setting, and that they said that actually this year they're feeling like things are getting back to pre-COVID times as far as how they're feeling like the kids are starting to settle in and not seeing as much of the effects as they've seen in the past few years. So that was interesting to me. I will say in my experience right now, what we're seeing in the middle school is when we first came back, there were more behavioral issues that we were dealing with, I think from the kids being home and not being able to interact. Now in our middle school, we're seeing more, oh my goodness, sorry about that. We're seeing more of the academic gaps coming in, which to me makes a lot of sense because the kids that we're getting now in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade we're actually at those critical periods when we were in COVID as far as being in first, second, third grade. And so with those critical foundational skills at that time, now we're seeing the gaps coming in that they're missing those skills. I think social and emotionally, we're seeing still some developmental delays in our kiddos. They're dealing more with things that we may have originally seen when they were younger. And so we're still seeing some of those delayed behaviors in our students from having that lack of interaction, social interaction with their peers back at that time. So those are the things in middle school that we're seeing mostly right now. Some of the social emotional, I don't know that we can just say it's post-COVID or due to COVID. I think we're seeing a lot of the anxiety, et cetera, building up. And I think some of that is more due to social media, and that's a whole nother topic. But I do see that that is a key piece that we need to look at in education as we move forward. The anxiety and the different effects. And I know we talk a lot about that at NASSP too, on how we can bring this and shed some light on it as we're advocating with policymakers. So I'll turn it over to Mike for the high school.
Yeah, I think you'll hear some of the same, and I'll avoid any just mere redundancy and say that I do think there's a sort of more normal feel around the day-to-day. I think that has come from at least the group that we now see in the high school. There's a more sincere appreciation for the concept of being present, which sounds counterintuitive when we compare it to the national phenomenon or the national epidemic of chronic absenteeism. Those two things are really running sort of side by each for us. I do think that the absenteeism piece is very real. It is, I do think, a byproduct of the ability of students to have learned to just shut things off for a couple of years. That became a very learned behavior. I'm struggling with something, I'll just shut it off. I'm at home and there's something going on, I'll just shut off school. And I do think that is real, and I hear that from a lot of my colleagues. But I do see that from a positive standpoint, and just in a review today of some disciplinary data. I'm in a school of about 600 students, which I know is small and has a very small sample size compared to a nation at large. But we have had 4 out-of-school suspension issues since the start of the school year. That is significantly lower than the last 2 or 3 years. And in fact, I could quadruple that number and it wouldn't be where we were a couple of years ago. So I see that as definitely, there's definitely a better feel in terms of the presence of school. And I think we're starting to see that perhaps turn around from an attendance standpoint. But at the same time, you do have people who are worried about being ill, being the one who causes other people to be ill. And it's a little bit more of a heightened anxiety on that part. I do think that, even things like this, there's more fluency with remote meetings and connecting with people in different ways that are all positives. And there are some things we did in those couple of years that got families engaged without having them in the building that have stayed as really strong practices. Getting comfortable with different technologies and not having as steep a learning curve. Those are all positives that we've been able to maintain. But the academic gap question, I think, is one of the bigger challenges that we're going to continue to address because, as Dr. Daniels just explained, for the kids that are starting high school, we have 9th graders who are in the building that missed out on some really significant time in middle school. For kids that are starting middle school, I have a daughter who's starting 5th grade this year. She missed out on a good chunk of kindergarten. And whether we're talking about the social or the academic curriculum, you do have some gaps. And I think we all have some gaps. So I think addressing those gaps just in calling them that and sharing where we're seeing struggles and not referring to them as pandemic centric has been a vernacular that we've had to adopt.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, I'm just going to pick up on a few things that you said, just as a follow-up. Dr. Daniels, with regard to the developmental delays that you're seeing that might have been caught earlier, and Dr. Rubin, you kind of alluded to some of these challenges too. This means that it requires some new things of educators in your school who may not, if you're middle school certified or high school certified teacher, you may not necessarily have been trained with the types of skills that are required for those students. How have you kind of managed that? I feel like that's a big challenge.
I'll start again. For us, and I'm in a school probably a little bit double the size of Mike. We have 1,600 students, so it is quite a large school. We have put, and our district has put a lot of emphasis on supporting students with social emotional funding, as far as getting more mental health workers, more counselors in the school. We have adopted in our particular school intervention period, which we refer to as flex, which is something that we've been trying to get for a long time, but the need has increased. And so during that period, we can offer intervention for academics for students who need it. Teachers can red check or call in those students to have that support. But we also have counselors and mental health workers on board that are dealing with some of those behaviors and concerns we see. And so things that you may have expected of students, and Mike referred to it with his own daughter, not having those experiences socially in kindergarten and first grade, we are starting to see some of those behaviors more so popping up in middle school students. You know, just even getting frustrated over things that normally in middle school they would have worked through by that point with their peers. Lots of hands-on behavior that is middle school has hands-on behavior anyway, but even more so where they're just not even able to recognize each other's personal space, that need to, sorry, there's my school bell. I'm just full of sounds today. I apologize.
You're living the principal life.
We're living it. We're living it. So those are kind of the things that we're seeing and that they're addressing in our district.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we actually have the 8th graders in my building, so I can certainly share the the hands-onsiness of middle schoolers. I think it's an interesting point about the social emotional wellness and managing expectations for students. As school leaders, it's actually not all that different in talking about students as we would talk about staff. I've shared that to be, and this is part of my philosophy, and is that to be unequivocally student focused, you at some point have to be very staff focused. And I come from a coaching background, and it is really about finding what makes people tick and managing those expectations. The reality is that the job was already hard. And now managing some of those challenges and the emotional toll that educators as people have gone through over the past few years. They have to take care of their families. They have to take care of their own children or their relatives. And there's economic burdens and there's political burdens and there's all these anxieties. And that is something that is, I think, very different for school leaders now than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But we still have expectations and we still have standards. And I think that is one of the things that we keep returning to with our staff is if we want to focus on doing our best for the children, for the students in our care, we have to do our best for each other. And we have to do our best for the profession at large. And I think that's something that we've taken to task with as a leadership team, and we've looked at, okay, what are the specific supports that our teachers need? What are some of the interventions? What's the curriculum? What are some of the technological tools? What are some of the efficiencies? What can we do to put the learning in people's hands so that they can do that the same way for students? And I do think it is a model, but this is not something that anybody in the last, I don't know, 100 years has been able to really comprehend from a standpoint of how they were trained to go into the business. So it's meeting the challenge in the here and now and figuring out what works, because that is something we can say we do.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you're talking about it as sort of a collaborative effort among your staff. I think that's what I heard, and trying to figure out what the efficiencies are. We just have a few more minutes, but I really want to give you the opportunity to respond to this question. If you were speaking to education policymakers or leaders and researchers, this is your moment, what would you like to share with them regarding pandemic recovery? What do they need to know?
Can I jump in first on this one?
Sure.
We're tagging across the country. This is amazing. Couldn't have picked two geographically further apart principles, Greg. Unless Alaska were here. I do have to say that from a policy standpoint and thinking of the work we do in Washington, these problems are not zip code centric. It doesn't matter whether you're in a blue state, a red state, a purple state, a rural town, a suburban town, an urban city. It doesn't matter whether your kids are well-resourced, low income, first generation, or in the 1%. The problems that we see that have emerged in the last 5 years are universal. And this is not, an easy necessarily an easy fix. But I think that the stakeholders that are out there sometimes making decisions in what they believe is the best interest of things like education are not educators. So please listen to educators. Please listen to leaders. Listen to what we're seeing and saying, because and I mean no disrespect by this, but like a bean counter in an office for a politician that is looking at test data doesn't know the story behind that, doesn't know what we're seeing. And I can tell you that if you talk to Dr. Daniels and I for 3 hours, we could both give you anecdotes about students and staff and people that are very, very, very real. And that's two really typical communities that could be placed anywhere. So, I come from Massachusetts. People talk about Massachusetts, say, oh yeah, there's the state. They always support education. And you know how our congressional policymakers are going to vote. But pandemic recovery is not a one-day moment. And it's not well, this is how previous generations did it, because it is so context dependent. And the one thing I will also say, and I've been sharing this a lot lately, is that familiarity does not mean functionality. Just because it's the way that you were familiar with how things might have worked at one time doesn't necessarily mean it's functional for today. Yeah. And we have to really be mindful of that.
Thank you.
I'll get off my soapbox now.
I appreciate it. I don't appreciate getting off the soapbox, but yeah. I appreciate the comment.
You have a great soapbox, because it is very true. And I think educators all across the United States would feel the same. Just talk to us. We're happy to share our stories and what we see day to day. I think there is no one size fits all. That local control does help a lot when we know our particular demographics and our particular needs at our school. Every school is different, even within the same district. 3 things I'm going to just say, and I'll say it quickly. One, you already alluded to, Susan, is the decline that we're finding. And I come from a school district that's very well sought out. It was very difficult to hire teachers this year for subjects. Math, I had started the school with subs, and that I have never had to do that before in my career. I know others all have done it for a while, but we did this year. So we are seeing a lot of people not going into the profession, and that is concerning. And as well as the leadership in education. And I think because of the pandemic and also politically, we experience a lot of heightened anxiety from the community. And I've seen that probably being the biggest issue, dealing with families and parents since the pandemic, which leads me into my own doctoral research, which I won't talk about too much, but how we support parents so that they can support their students. I would say that's a stakeholder group that is often left out. And I think that we're seeing the effects on our kids by how their parents are dealing with things in society. And then third is SPED. Special education is really, really in need of support. We definitely aren't seeing as many people going into the special education field. And it is really impacting day to day. I would say probably in my experience right now, I am dealing more with special education than I ever have in my 40 years. And I was a special education teacher at one time. So the needs are really, really high. I think not only for all students, but for our special education students, we're seeing a lot of very heightened behaviors, and that could be due to what they experienced being apart from peers and from society during the pandemic. So those are my 3 areas that I would bring up: parents, SPED, and of course the retention and recruitment of teachers and staff.
Yes. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your honest insights into your day-to-day in the pandemic recovery. I really appreciate your participation. Thank you to Greg for introducing us to this